In the quiet streets of Millbrook, a successful tech entrepreneur was about to face the woman who shattered his world. What started as a simple return home for his sister's wedding took a shocking turn when he came face to face with the brutal reality behind a perfect marriage. Jake Thompson wasn't your typical small-town success story. For 9 years, he had spent his life building an empire from nothing, known for his relentless drive and the emotional armor he wore like a second skin. When he encountered Emma Sullivan struggling beneath her husband's controlling grip, he had no idea he was walking into a deadly confrontation that would force him to choose between his carefully constructed new life and saving the woman who once destroyed him. Jake's decision to act that would lead to a rescue mission that nearly cost Emma her life. What began as a wedding celebration would become a fight for survival and redemption. The town of Millbrook would never be the same after discovering that their golden couple's perfect marriage was built on a foundation of fear, control, and violence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tesla's navigation system announced his arrival in Millbrook with the same clinical precision it had used for the past 3 hours, but Jake Thompson's hands remained locked on the steering wheel long after he'd parked. Through the windshield, Main Street stretched before him like a museum exhibit, unchanged, perfectly preserved, mocking him with its stubborn familiarity. 9 years. 9 years since he'd left this place as a broken college graduate with $23 in his checking account and a rejection that had carved itself so deep into his chest he could still feel the scar tissue pulling tight when he breathed wrong. Now he sat in a car worth more than most houses in Millbrook, wearing a watch that cost more than his father had made in 6 months at the textile mill, and somehow felt smaller than he had at 22. The coffee shop hadn't changed. Miller's Roast still occupied the corner building with its hand-painted sign and mismatched outdoor furniture. Jake's jaw tightened as he stared at the table by the window. The same table where Emma Richardson had looked him in the eye and delivered the words that had rewritten the trajectory of his entire existence. "You're sweet, Jake, but you're not serious. You're not someone a girl builds a future with. You're more like a practice boyfriend. I need someone who can actually provide for a family, someone with real prospects." The memory hit with surgical precision, complete with the way her voice had carried just loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. The way conversations had stopped. The way Tommy Morrison had snickered from behind the counter. The way Jake had sat there, the engagement ring he'd scraped together money for burning a hole in his pocket, watching his entire world collapse in real time. He'd driven straight through the night that day, heading east with no plan except to get as far from Millbrook as possible. Sleeping in his car, working construction jobs that paid cash, eventually landing in Boston, where desperation had led him to answer an ad for a coding boot camp that promised to change lives in 6 months. The boot camp had been garbage, but it had introduced him to Marcus Chen, a venture capitalist's son who saw potential in Jake's obsessive work ethic and raw intelligence. Marcus had become his first investor, his mentor, and eventually his business partner in a series of increasingly successful tech ventures. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that another Marcus had helped him rebuild what Emma's Marcus had helped her destroy. But success, Jake had learned, was a poor salve for certain kinds of wounds. The Millbrook Inn sat 3 blocks down from Miller's Roast, a Victorian-era building that had been converted to boutique accommodations sometime after Jake had left. The desk clerk, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up as he approached. "Welcome to Millbrook Inn. Checking in?" "Jake Thompson. I have a reservation." Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Thompson. Jake Thompson. Well, I'll be damned." She looked up at him with recognition dawning in her eyes. "Danny Thompson's boy? You're Katie's brother?" Jake nodded, his guard immediately rising. "That's right. I'm Carol Peterson. I was your 3rd-grade teacher, though I don't suppose you remember. You were always so quiet, so focused on your books." Her smile was genuine, but Jake could see her taking inventory. The expensive clothes, the confidence he wore like armor, the way he held himself now. "My goodness, look at you. Katie said you'd done well for yourself, but—" "Yeah, well—" Jake signed the registration form with deliberate casualness. "Sometimes life surprises you." Carol handed him his key card, her expression thoughtful. "She's proud of you, you know. Katie." Talks about her big brother, the entrepreneur, all the time. Though between you and me, I think she's been worried about you coming back. Said you haven't been home since your father's funeral. 7 years ago. Jake had flown in for the service, stayed exactly long enough to see his father buried, and left without speaking to anyone except Katie and his mother. Even then, he'd felt the weight of the town's collective memory, the whispered conversations about what had happened to poor Jake Thompson after Emma Richardson broke his heart so publicly. "Business keeps me busy," Jake said, pocketing the key card. "I'm sure it does. Well, you'll want to know. The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night at the country club." Katie's beside herself with excitement. And nervous, if I'm being honest. First big wedding the town's seen in years. Jake's chest tightened. "I'm sure it'll be beautiful." "Oh, it will be. Though there's been some talk." Carol's voice dropped slightly, taking on the conspiratorial tone that Jake remembered being the currency of small-town life. "About some of the guests. You know Emma Richardson. Well, Emma Sullivan now. She'll be there, of course. She and Katie stayed close after high school, but folks are saying her marriage isn't what it appears to be." Jake's hand stilled on the keycard. "I see. Not that it's any of my business," Carol continued. "But Marcus Sullivan, her husband, he's been spending an awful lot of time in the city lately. And when he is in town, well, let's just say the bloom seems to be off that particular rose." The information hit Jake like a physical blow, though he couldn't say whether it was satisfaction or something more complicated. Emma's perfect life, the one she'd chosen over him, wasn't so perfect after all. "Well," Jake managed, "I'm sure it's none of my concern." Carol's eyes sharpened slightly, as if she could read the careful neutrality in his voice. "Of course not. Though I do hope you'll be able to enjoy the wedding without any awkwardness. Katie's worked so hard to make everything perfect." Jake climbed the stairs to his room, Carol's words echoing in his mind. The room was tastefully decorated, all antique furniture and local artwork, but Jake barely noticed. He stood at the window looking down at Main Street and tried to process what he was feeling. For 9 years, he'd carried the image of Emma, living her perfect life with her perfect husband in their perfect house. The fantasy of her happiness had been both his greatest motivation and his deepest torment. Every success he'd achieved had been shadowed by the knowledge that she had chosen someone else, someone better, someone worthy of the life she wanted. But if that perfect life was crumbling... Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Katie. "Can't wait to see you. Dinner at Mom's house at 6, just family. Need to talk to you about something important." He checked his watch. 4:30. Enough time to shower, change, and prepare himself for the minefield of family dynamics and small-town nostalgia. But as he moved toward the bathroom, his reflection caught his eye in the antique mirror above the dresser. The man looking back at him bore little resemblance to the uncertain 22-year-old who'd fled Millbrook 9 years ago. Success had carved new lines around his eyes, confidence had straightened his shoulders, and money had given him the kind of polish that opened doors and commanded respect. But underneath it all, Jake could still see that younger man, wounded, desperate, convinced he wasn't enough. "You're not someone a girl builds a future with." Emma's words echoed in the quiet room, as fresh and cutting as the day she'd spoken them. Jake had built an empire, accumulated wealth most people could only dream of, and earned the respect of some of the most powerful people in tech. But standing in this room, in this town, with the knowledge that he would see Emma again in less than 24 hours, he felt the familiar ache of inadequacy settling in his chest like an old injury before a storm. Outside, Main Street bustled with its usual afternoon activity. Somewhere in this town, Emma Sullivan was living her life, dealing with whatever cracks had appeared in her marriage's foundation. And tomorrow, for the first time in 9 years, they would be in the same room. Jake turned away from the mirror and began to unpack his suitcase. Whatever happened at Katie's wedding, he would face it as the man he'd become, not the boy he'd been. But as he hung his suits in the antique armoire, he couldn't shake the feeling that all his success, all his transformation, was about to be tested in ways he wasn't prepared for. The past, Jake was learning, had its own gravitational pull. And Millbrook, for all its small-town charm, was about to become the center of a collision he'd been both avoiding and anticipating for nearly a decade. The bathroom mirror reflected nothing but lies back at Emma Sullivan. Each careful stroke of concealer, another layer of deception she'd become expert at applying. The bruise on her collarbone was nearly invisible now, hidden beneath foundation and the high neckline of her dress. Marcus had been careful, as always. Nothing that would show in sleeveless summer dresses or wedding photos. "You're being dramatic," she whispered to her reflection, echoing the words Marcus had spoken 3 nights ago when she'd confronted him about the text messages. "Marriage requires compromise, Emma. You knew that when you signed the papers. But the text messages had been harder to explain away than the casual cruelties. Can't wait to taste you again. Same hotel Thursday?" The message from Melissa Carter, the ambitious young associate at Marcus's firm, had been explicit enough to shatter any remaining illusions Emma had clung to about her marriage. She'd found them by accident, reaching for Marcus's phone, when hers died and she needed to call her father about wedding arrangements. The screen had lit up with the notification, and Emma's world had shifted on its axis for the second time in her life. The first had been in college, when she'd realized Jake Thompson was serious about proposing. The second was standing in their marble-appointed kitchen, staring at evidence that her husband of 6 years was sleeping with a woman barely older than Emma had been when she'd made the choice to marry for security instead of love. "Emma?" Marcus's voice carried from their bedroom, tinged with the impatience that had become his default tone with her. "The Richardson name still means something in this town. Your behavior at this wedding will reflect on both our families." Emma's hand stilled on her lipstick. Everything with Marcus was about reflection, about image, about what people would think. Even their fight 3 days ago had been conducted in careful whispers, as if the walls of their Georgian colonial might gossip to the neighbors about the cracks in their foundation. "I'm almost ready," she called back, though she wasn't sure she'd ever be ready for what tonight would bring. Katie Thompson's rehearsal dinner, Jake Thompson's return. The first time in 9 years she'd have to face the man whose heart she'd broken to build the life that was now crumbling around her. Marcus appeared in the bathroom doorway, straightening his cufflinks with practiced precision. At 41, he was still handsome in the way that generational wealth and good breeding produced. Tall, lean, with silver threading through dark hair that made him look distinguished rather than aging. His suit was immaculate, his shoes Italian leather, his smile the same one that had charmed her father and half the town when he'd swept into Millbrook 7 years ago like a prince in a fairy tale. "You look beautiful," he said, though his eyes were already assessing, cataloging any potential flaws that might embarrass him in public. Though perhaps the pearl necklace instead of the gold? More appropriate for a small-town wedding. Emma's throat constricted. The gold necklace had been her grandmother's, one of the few pieces of jewelry that held actual meaning for her rather than monetary value. But she nodded and switched it out, watching Marcus's approval in the mirror. "I spoke with your father this afternoon," Marcus continued, adjusting his tie. "He's concerned about some of the rumors circulating about us. I assured him they were baseless gossip, the kind of thing small towns thrive on." "What rumors?" Emma's voice came out smaller than she intended. Marcus's eyes met hers in the mirror, and for a moment, she saw something cold and calculating beneath his practiced charm. Nothing specific. Just the usual whispers that follow. Any successful couple. People always want to believe that success comes with a price, that happiness must be an illusion. Emma wanted to ask about Melissa Carter, wanted to demand answers about the hotel visits and the late nights, and the way he'd started looking at her like she was an obligation rather than a wife. But the words stuck in her throat, trapped by 6 years of conditioning that had taught her to doubt her own perceptions, to trust Marcus's version of reality over her own instincts. "The Thompson boy will be there tonight," Marcus said casually, though Emma caught the sharp attention in his voice. "Katie's brother. I understand. He's done quite well for himself in Boston. Tech industry." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her earrings. "I wouldn't know. We haven't spoken in years." "Of course not, though I imagine it might be awkward given your history." Marcus's tone was light, conversational, but Emma recognized the undercurrent of warning. "I trust you'll handle any complications with your usual grace." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus had heard the stories about Emma and Jake, had probably done his research before proposing. He knew about the public rejection, the messy aftermath, The way Emma had chosen security over love and broken a good man's heart in the process. And he was reminding her that her reputation, her standing in the community, her relationship with her father, all of it depended on maintaining the illusion of their perfect marriage. "There won't be any complications," Emma said quietly. "Jake and I were over a long time ago." Marcus smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Good. Your father has worked too hard to build his reputation in this community for it to be damaged by old scandals, and my family has certain expectations about propriety." Emma finished applying her lipstick with steady hands, though inside she felt like she was drowning. The woman in the mirror looked perfect, beautiful, composed, the ideal wife of a successful attorney. But underneath the carefully applied makeup and designer dress, Emma felt like a stranger to herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Ashley. "Want me to pick you up? We could arrive together. Moral support." Emma glanced at Marcus, who was reading his own messages with a slight frown. Probably Melissa, she thought, though she didn't have the courage to voice the suspicion. "Ashley offered to drive me," Emma said carefully. "So you wouldn't have to leave early if you get called away for work." It was a weak excuse, and they both knew it. Marcus rarely got emergency calls that couldn't wait until morning. But he nodded approvingly, probably relieved he wouldn't have to maintain their charade for the entire evening. "That's thoughtful of her. I'll meet you there." He checked his watch, a Rolex that had belonged to his grandfather. "Don't be late. First, impressions matter and people will be watching." People were always watching in Millbrook. That was both the blessing and the curse of small-town life. The sense of community came with the price of constant scrutiny. Emma had learned to perform her role as the perfect wife, the successful woman who had chosen wisely and lived happily, ever after. But tonight, with Jake returning and her marriage falling apart behind closed doors, the performance felt more exhausting than ever. After Marcus left, Emma sat on the edge of their bed and stared at her hands. The diamond engagement ring he'd given her was flawless, a 2-carat solitaire that had made every woman in Millbrook gasp with envy when she'd shown it off 7 years ago. It caught the light from their bedroom chandelier, throwing tiny rainbows across the cream-colored walls. She thought about the ring Jake had tried to give her 9 years ago, a modest solitaire he'd saved for months to afford, working 3 part-time jobs while finishing his degree. She'd never even let him take it out of his pocket before delivering. The rejection that had sent him fleeing from Millbrook like his life depended on it. "You're not someone a girl builds a future with." The words echoed in her memory, as sharp and cruel as the day she'd spoken them. She'd meant them to be kind, in her own way, a clean break, honesty about what she needed from life, from a partner. But looking back, Emma could see how devastating they must have been. How public. How calculated to destroy not just his proposal, but his entire sense of self-worth. And now he was back. Successful. Wealthy. Everything she'd claimed he'd never be. While her own carefully constructed life was revealed to be built on foundations of sand. Emma's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Katie. "So excited for tonight. Can't wait for you to see how amazing Jake looks. Success suits him." Emma stared at the message, her stomach twisting with something she couldn't quite name. Regret? Curiosity? Fear? All of the above? She stood and walked to her bedroom window, looking out at the perfectly manicured grounds of their neighborhood. Every house was a testament to success, stability, the kind of life she'd thought she wanted. But tonight, for the first time in years, Emma found herself wondering what her life might have looked like if she'd chosen differently 9 years ago. If she'd chosen love over security, if she'd chosen Jake over Marcus, if she'd chosen the uncertain future of a struggling college graduate over the guaranteed comfort of old money and established prestige. But those were dangerous thoughts, the kind that led to regret and second-guessing and the slow dissolution of everything she'd worked to build. Emma pushed them away and grabbed her purse, checking her appearance one last time in the hall mirror. Tonight, she would play her role. She would be gracious and charming and give no indication that her marriage was a carefully constructed lie. She would face Jake Thompson with dignity and composure, showing him that she had chosen correctly, that her life was everything she'd claimed to want. But as she walked to her car, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that tonight would be a reckoning. she wasn't prepared for. And somewhere deep inside, in a place she'd learned to keep carefully locked away, a part of her was terrified of what she might see when she looked into Jake Thompson's eyes again. The Millbrook Country Club hadn't changed much in 9 years, though someone had updated the carpet and added what appeared to be actual artwork to the walls. Jake stood in the parking lot for a full minute, watching other guests arrive through the wide windows before finally forcing himself to walk toward the entrance. Inside, the space hummed with the comfortable chatter of people who'd known each other for decades. Jake recognized faces immediately. Older now, some showing the comfortable expansion of middle age, others fighting it with varying degrees of success. But their eyes found him with the same mixture of curiosity and judgment he remembered, now sharpened by surprise at his transformation. Jake Thompson. The voice belonged to Tom Miller, who'd taken over his father's coffee shop and apparently still held grudges. "Well, I'll be damned. Heard you'd done all right for yourself up in Boston." The way Tom said, "all right," made it clear he'd heard considerably more than that, probably inflated by the small-town gossip mill into something approaching legend. Jake nodded politely, his defenses automatically rising. "Tom, good to see you." Jake's tone was carefully neutral, though he could feel the weight of a dozen conversations pausing as people noticed his arrival. "That your Tesla out there?" Tom's grin had an edge to it. Fancy wheels for a boy who used to walk everywhere. Before Jake could respond, he felt a familiar hand on his arm and turned to see Katie approaching, radiant in a blue dress that brought out her eyes. At 28, she'd grown into the kind of beauty that came from genuine happiness rather than careful maintenance, and Jake felt his first real smile of the evening. "There's my big brother," Katie said, stretching up, to hug him tightly. "You look incredible. Success really does suit you." "You look pretty incredible yourself," Jake replied, meaning it. "Where's the lucky groom?" "Dave's around here somewhere, probably talking baseball with Dad's old friends." Katie's eyes sparkled with mischief. "He's nervous about meeting you." "You know, I may have talked you up a bit." "Katie Thompson, building me up to impossible standards as usual." "Katie Thompson Chen, as of tomorrow," she corrected. Then her expression grew more serious. "Can we talk for a minute? Privately?" She led him toward a quieter corner of the room, past clusters of guests who tracked their movement with interested eyes. Jake noticed the way conversations shifted as they passed, the subtle lowering of voices that indicated his return was already becoming the evening's primary source of gossip. "I need to warn you about something," Katie said when they'd found a relatively private alcove. "Emma's here. She came with Ashley Morgan. You remember Ashley from high school?" Jake's chest tightened, though he'd been expecting this. "I figured she would be. You two stayed close." "We did. But Jake..." Katie's voice dropped to a whisper. "Her marriage is falling apart. Has been for a while, from what Ashley tells me. Marcus is, well, he's not the man she thought she was marrying." The information hit Jake like a physical blow, though he wasn't sure what he felt. Vindication, sympathy, a dangerous combination of both. "That's rough," he managed. "But it's not really my concern." Katie's expression sharpened with the look she'd perfected as a teenager when she thought her big brother was being particularly dense. "Isn't it? Jake, you never got over her. Not really. And now you're both here. Both in very different places than you were 9 years ago." "Katie, I'm not trying to play matchmaker," she said quickly. "I just want you to be prepared. Because when Emma sees what you've become, how successful you are, it's going to complicate things. For both of you." Before Jake could respond, he became aware of a shift in the room's energy. Conversations didn't stop, but they muted, and he could feel the collective attention of the room focusing on something behind him. He turned, following the subtle direction of a dozen gazes, and saw her. Emma Richardson, Emma Sullivan now, stood in the doorway with Ashley Morgan, and Jake's carefully constructed emotional armor cracked down the middle. She was still beautiful, but it was a different kind of beauty than he remembered. More polished, more carefully curated. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant updo that probably cost more than Jake used to make in a week, and her dress was the kind of understated elegance that whispered money rather than shouting it. But there was something in her posture, a careful stiffness that spoke of constant self-monitoring, that made Jake's chest ache with unexpected recognition. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, 9 years collapsed into nothing. Jake saw surprise flicker across her features, followed quickly by something that might have been pain, before her expression smoothed into polite neutrality. "Showtime," Katie murmured beside him. Emma began making her way through the room, stopping to greet people with practiced warmth while clearly navigating toward him. Ashley stayed close, playing the role of protective best friend with obvious expertise. Jake found himself cataloging details, the way Emma held herself with perfect posture, the smile that looked genuine but didn't quite reach her eyes, the expensive watch that matched her expensive dress and expensive life. When she finally reached him, the surrounding conversations had died to a barely concealed murmur of anticipation. "Jake." Her voice was carefully modulated, neither warm nor cold. "Katie told me you were coming. It's good to see you." "Emma." Jake was proud of how steady his own voice sounded. "You look well." It was the kind of empty exchange that meant everything and nothing, loaded with 9 years of history and the weight of a dozen watching eyes. Ashley stepped slightly closer to Emma, a gesture Jake recognized as protective positioning. "I hear you've done incredibly well for yourself," Emma continued. "Tech industry, right? Boston?" "Among other places." Jake kept his response deliberately vague, though he could see the curiosity in her eyes. "I hear congratulations are in order. Marriage, family, everything you wanted." Something flickered across Emma's face at that. Pain, maybe, or regret. But it was gone so quickly Jake almost thought he'd imagined it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Though it's just Marcus and me. No children yet." The pause that followed, stretched uncomfortably long, filled with everything they weren't saying, and everything the watching crowd was straining to hear. Jake became aware of Katie beside him, tense with protective energy, and Ashley beside Emma, radiating similar vigilance. "Well," Emma finally said, "I should let you get back to enjoying the party. I'm sure you have a lot of people to catch up with." She started to turn away, and Jake felt something desperate and reckless rise in his chest. "Emma." She stopped, looking back at him with carefully controlled expression. "It really is good to see you," he said, and meant it in ways that scared him. For just a moment, her careful composure slipped, and Jake caught a glimpse of something raw and vulnerable in her eyes. Then it was gone, hidden behind the polished facade she'd perfected. "You too, Jake. You too." She walked away, Ashley close, beside her, and Jake watched her go with the strange sensation that he was seeing 2 different women. The confident, successful wife everyone else saw, and something underneath that looked suspiciously like a woman trapped in a life that was slowly suffocating her. "That went well," Katie said dryly beside him. Before Jake could respond, he became aware of another presence approaching. Male, confident, carrying the kind of authority that came from generational wealth and social position. Jake turned to find himself face to face with Emma Sullivan, and immediately understood why Emma had chosen him 9 years ago. Marcus was everything Jake had never been. Tall, classically handsome, wearing his expensive suit like it was a natural extension of his skin. His smile was perfect, practiced, and completely empty of warmth as he extended his hand. "Jake Thompson," Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough emphasis to make it clear he knew exactly who Jake was and what he represented. "Marcus Sullivan, I've heard quite a lot about you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Jake shook his hand, noting the firmness of the grip and the challenge in Marcus's eyes. "All good things, I hope." "Oh, absolutely. Emma's told me all about your history together. College sweethearts, wasn't it? Before she decided to pursue more serious prospects." The casual cruelty of the comment was delivered with such smooth precision that it took Jake a moment to process the intentional wound. But when he did, something cold and dangerous settled in his chest. "Ancient history," Jake replied evenly. "Though I'm glad it worked out for everyone involved. Emma seems very, settled." Marcus's smile sharpened at the subtle emphasis Jake put on the last word. She is indeed. We both are. It's amazing how much clarity comes with maturity, don't you think? Understanding what really matters in life. Absolutely, Jake agreed. Though sometimes what we think matters at 23 looks pretty shallow by 31. The tension between them was thick enough to cut, and Jake could see people beginning to notice. Katie moved closer to his side, while across the room, Emma was watching their interaction with poorly concealed anxiety. Marcus followed Jake's gaze, then looked back with a smile that had gone predatory. Well, I should get back to my wife. She tends to worry when I'm away too long. Old habits from our early days, when she had to compete for my attention. The comment was calculated to wound, and it succeeded. But it also revealed something Marcus probably hadn't intended: his own insecurity, his need to establish dominance, his awareness that Jake's presence represented some kind of threat. Of course, Jake said smoothly. I wouldn't want to keep you from what matters most. Marcus nodded curtly and walked away, his posture radiating satisfaction. But Jake caught the way Emma's shoulders tensed as her husband approached, the subtle step backward she took, the careful smile she arranged on her face. It was the body language of someone preparing for impact, and it told Jake more about the Sullivan marriage than any amount of gossip ever could. Beside him, Katie let out a breath she'd apparently been holding. Well, that was pleasant. Charming guy, Jake replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. I can see why Emma chose him. Jake, Katie's voice carried a warning. Whatever you're thinking, don't. This is my wedding weekend, and I won't have it turned into a battlefield over ancient history. Jake looked at his sister, seeing the worry in her eyes and the tension in her posture. She was right, of course. This wasn't about him, wasn't about Emma, wasn't about the wreckage of a relationship that had ended 9 years ago. This was Katie's moment, her happiness, her future. But as Jake watched Emma across the room, saw the way she held herself like she was made of glass that might shatter at any moment, saw the possessive way Marcus's hand rested on her back, he couldn't shake the feeling that some collisions were inevitable. That 9 years of separation and transformation had only been building pressure. And now that they were in the same room again, something was going to give. The question was whether he'd be strong enough to walk away when it did. The rehearsal. Dinner continued around them, conversations flowing like wine, laughter rising and falling in comfortable waves. But Jake felt like he was standing in the eye of a storm, watching the careful choreography of small-town social dynamics while sensing the dangerous currents moving underneath. And somewhere across the room, Emma Sullivan was performing her own careful dance, playing the role of the happy wife while her eyes occasionally found his, carrying messages he didn't dare try to interpret. Tomorrow was Katie's wedding day. Tomorrow, he would stand up as best man, smile for photos, and celebrate his sister's happiness with genuine joy. But tonight, in the space between who he'd been and who he'd become, Jake Thompson found himself wondering if some wounds never really healed. They just learned to wait for the right moment to bleed again. The terrace of the Millbrook Country Club overlooked the golf course, where moonlight painted the rolling greens in shades of silver and shadow. Jake had escaped here after an hour of careful conversation and careful smiles, nursing a whiskey that had grown warm in his hand while he tried to process the evening's revelations. He wasn't alone for long. I wondered if you might be out here. Emma's voice carried across the stone terrace, soft enough not to startle but clear enough to announce her presence. You always did prefer the quiet spaces. Jake turned, finding her silhouetted in the doorway. She'd removed her jacket, and the moonlight caught the delicate line of her shoulders, the careful way she held herself like she was afraid of taking up too much space. Needed some air, Jake said, his voice carefully neutral. It's a lot of faces, a lot of history. Emma stepped onto the terrace, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. Marcus is holding court inside. Something about a case. He won last month. He likes an audience. The way she said it, flat, resigned, told Jake more than any direct criticism could have. He watched her move to the stone railing, maintaining careful distance between them, while still creating the intimacy of shared space. You look good, Jake. The words came out quietly, almost reluctantly. I mean, Successful, happy, like you found what you were looking for. Jake studied her profile in the moonlight, noting the tension around her eyes, the way her hands gripped the railing like she needed something solid to hold on to. Have I? I'm not sure I ever knew what I was looking for. Purpose, maybe? You always had such big dreams, such certainty about changing the world through technology. Emma's laugh held no humor. I admired that about you, even when I thought it was naive. The admission hung between them like a confession. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of anger he'd carried for so long it had become part of his foundation. What about you? He asked quietly. Did you find what you were looking for? Emma was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought I did. For a while anyway. The house, the status, the security my father always said was important. The life that looked perfect from the outside. Looked perfect? Another long pause. Jake could hear the distant sounds of the party through the windows. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses. Normal sounds from a normal celebration that felt a world away from this terrace, this moment, this conversation that was careening toward territory neither of them had planned to explore. Jake. Emma turned to face him, and in the moonlight, he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. I need to tell you something about that day, about what I said to you. Emma, you don't. I do. Her voice gained strength, urgency. I've carried it for 9 years, and seeing you tonight, seeing what you've become, I can't carry it anymore. Jake felt his defenses rising, the old wounds preparing for fresh salt. It's ancient history. We were different people then. I was scared. The words came out in a rush, like a dam breaking. I was terrified, Jake. You were talking about the future, about building something together, about taking risks and following dreams, and all I could think about was my father's business failing, when I was 12. Watching him age 10 years in one summer. Listening to my parents fight about money, about choices, about security. Jake felt the world tilt slightly. Emma. You were offering me an adventure, a partnership, a leap of faith, and I was 22 years old and so afraid of being poor, of being uncertain, of not having guarantees that I convinced myself I needed to choose safety over love. Emma's voice broke on the last word. But the way I did it, the things I said, Jake, I knew exactly how much they would hurt. I knew exactly how public and humiliating it would be, and I did it anyway because I thought if I hurt you badly enough, you'd stop trying to change my mind. The confession hit Jake like a physical blow. 9 years of believing he hadn't been enough, that he'd been found wanting and dismissed. 9 years of driving himself to prove he was worthy of love, of success, of consideration. And it had all been built on a lie. Not a lie about Emma's feelings, but a lie about his own inadequacy. Why tell me this now? Jake's voice came out, rougher than he intended. Because seeing you tonight, seeing what you've accomplished, what you've become, I realize what I destroyed. Not just your heart, Jake. I destroyed my own chance at happiness. I chose Marcus because he represented everything I thought I needed. Stability, status, security, a guaranteed future. Emma wiped at her eyes with trembling fingers. But guarantees are illusions, Jake, and the price of that illusion has been higher than I ever imagined. Jake watched her carefully, noting the way her hands shook, the careful way she stood like she was afraid of being overheard. What price? Emma was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was so soft Jake had to lean closer to hear her. He controls everything. What I wear, where I go, who I see. He monitors my phone, my email, my spending. He tells me what to think about current events, what opinions to have at dinner parties. And when I step out of line, when I show any independence or question any decision. She touched her throat unconsciously, and Jake felt rage bloom white-hot in his chest. Emma. His voice was deadly quiet. Is he hurting you? Not the way you mean. He's too smart for that. Nothing that shows, nothing that can't be explained as an accident or my own clumsiness. Emma's laugh was bitter. He's a lawyer, Jake. He knows exactly how much he can do without leaving evidence. Jake's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The successful, confident man he'd become wanted to storm inside, to confront Marcus publicly, to expose him for the predator he clearly was. But the boy who'd been humiliated in this same town 9 years ago understood the complexity of Emma's situation, the web of control and manipulation that made escape seem impossible. Why haven't you left? Where would I go? What would I do? I haven't worked in 4 years. Marcus convinced me I didn't need to, that my job was supporting his career. I have no money of my own, no credit in my name, no skills that weren't rendered obsolete while I was playing the perfect wife. Emma's voice grew stronger, edged with anger. And even if I could leave, where would that leave my father? Marcus handles all his legal work now. His business depends on Marcus's connections, his referrals. If I left, if I made accusations, Marcus could destroy him. Jake felt the full weight of Emma's trap settling around him like a physical presence. Marcus hadn't just married her. He'd systematically isolated her, made her dependent, woven himself into the fabric of her family's livelihood so completely that leaving him would mean destroying everyone she loved. There has to be a way, Jake said, though he wasn't sure. He believed it. Is there? I'm 31 years old, Jake. I have a degree in art history that's gathering dust, no work experience, no independence, no way to support myself. And even if I could figure all that out, even if I could find the courage to leave, what then? Go back to my father's house in shame? Prove to everyone in Millbrook that I made the wrong choice, that I destroyed a good man's heart for nothing? The bitterness in her voice cut through Jake like a knife. He could see it now, the careful trap Marcus had constructed, using Emma's own fears and insecurities against her. The way he'd isolated her from friends, from work, from any source of confidence or independence. The way he'd made himself indispensable to her father's business, ensuring that leaving him would feel like betraying her family. Emma. Jake stepped closer, close enough to see the tears tracking down her cheeks in the moonlight. You're not the same person who was afraid at 22. You're stronger than you think. Am I? Because right now I feel like that scared girl who was so terrified of uncertainty that she destroyed the best thing in her life to avoid it. The words hung between them, loaded with 9 years of regret and pain. Jake felt something crack, open in his chest, some carefully maintained wall between past and present crumbling under the weight of her honesty. Jake? Emma's voice was barely audible. Can you ever forgive me? Not for choosing Marcus. I know that decision cost both of us too much for simple forgiveness. But for the way I did it, for the cruelty, for the public humiliation, for making you believe you weren't enough when the truth was, I was too broken to recognize what I had. Jake looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the woman who had shattered his heart, but the girl who had been so afraid of poverty, of uncertainty, of making the wrong choice that she'd made the worst choice possible. He saw the price she'd paid for her fear, the ways she'd been diminished and controlled and made to believe she deserved no better. And underneath his anger, underneath 9 years of hurt and resentment, Jake found something he hadn't expected. Compassion. Emma, he said quietly. We were both different people then. We both made choices based on fear instead of love. The difference is, you're still living with the consequences of yours. Before she could respond, the terrace door opened with a sharp crack, spilling light and sound from the party. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his silhouette backlit and imposing. There you are, darling. His voice carried easily across the terrace, warm and concerned for any potential listeners, but with an undercurrent that made Jake's skin crawl. I've been looking everywhere for you. It's getting late, and you know how you get when you're overtired. Emma's entire body went rigid, and Jake watched her transform before his eyes, the vulnerable, honest woman disappearing behind a mask of careful compliance. I'm sorry, Emma said, her voice automatically shifting to the apologetic tone of someone who'd learned that everything was somehow her fault. I just needed some air. The room was getting warm. Marcus stepped onto the terrace, and Jake felt the man's attention focus on him with laser precision. Thompson. I hope you haven't been monopolizing my wife's time. She tends to get sentimental at weddings. starts dwelling on the past instead of appreciating the present. The warning was clear, delivered with Marcus's trademark blend of charm and menace. Jake felt every muscle in his body tense, the successful businessman warring with the protective instincts that had been dormant for years. "Actually," Jake said, his voice carefully controlled, "I was just heading back inside. Early morning tomorrow with the wedding preparations." He looked at Emma, trying to convey in a glance everything he couldn't say aloud. That he'd heard her, that he understood, that she wasn't as alone as she felt. But her eyes were already downcast, her posture already shifting into the careful submission Marcus expected. "Good night, Emma," Jake said quietly. "It was illuminating to talk with you." He walked past Marcus, close enough to smell the man's expensive cologne and feel the waves of controlled hostility radiating from him. At the doorway, Jake paused. "Marcus?" he said conversationally. "Emma mentioned you handle her father's legal work now. That's quite a responsibility, having someone's entire livelihood in your hands." Marcus's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Indeed. Families depend on each other, don't they? We all do what we must to protect the people we love." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Absolutely. Though I've found that true protection usually involves making people stronger, not more dependent. Good night." He walked back into the party, leaving Marcus and Emma alone on the terrace, but he could feel the weight of Marcus's stare burning into his back. Inside, the celebration continued with its easy laughter and comfortable conversations, but Jake felt like he was seeing it all through new eyes. Emma Richardson, Emma Sullivan, was trapped in a web of control and manipulation that would have been impressive in its thoroughness if it wasn't so devastating in its effect. And Marcus Sullivan was revealed not as the golden prince who'd won the princess, but as a predator who'd identified a vulnerable woman and systematically destroyed her ability to escape. Jake made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations on his success and deflecting questions about his return to Millbrook. But his mind was racing, processing everything Emma had told him and everything he'd observed. 9 years ago, he'd left Millbrook convinced he wasn't worthy of love, wasn't successful enough, wasn't man enough to deserve someone like Emma Richardson. Now he was beginning to understand that the real tragedy wasn't his rejection. It was what Emma had accepted in his place. And as he finally made his excuses and headed back to the inn, Jake found himself wondering if some debts could never be truly settled, if some wounds ran too deep for healing, and if the woman who'd broken his heart might need saving from the life she'd chosen instead. Katie's wedding day dawned with the kind of perfect September weather that seemed designed by divine intervention. Clear skies, golden light, and a gentle breeze that carried the last whispers of summer. Jake stood in the bridal suite's adjoining room, adjusting his tie for the third time, while listening to the controlled chaos of wedding preparations through the thin walls. He'd slept badly, his conversation with Emma replaying in his mind until dawn. Every revelation felt like a piece of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve for 9 years, only to discover the picture it formed was far more disturbing than he'd ever imagined. "You're going to strangle yourself with that tie if you keep fidgeting." Katie appeared in the doorway, radiant in her wedding dress, but wearing the sharp expression she'd perfected as his younger sister. "What's wrong? And don't say, 'Nothing. I can read you like a book.'" Jake forced his hands to still. "Nothing's wrong. Just want everything to be perfect for you." Katie stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Jake, last night after the rehearsal dinner, half the town was buzzing about you and Emma disappearing onto the terrace. The other half was talking about how Marcus looked like he wanted to commit murder when he went to find her. So let's try again. What's wrong?" Jake studied his sister's face, seeing the worry beneath her wedding day glow. Katie deserved honesty, but she also deserved a wedding day free from the complications of his tangled history with Emma Sullivan. "It's complicated," he said finally. "It always is, with you two." Katie moved to the window, looking out at the garden where guests were already beginning to gather. Ashley's been Emma's maid of honor twice now. Once when she was Emma Richardson, at her college roommate's wedding, and now as Emma Sullivan at mine. She says Emma's changed, that the light's gone out of her somehow. Jake felt his chest tighten. "Katie, I'm not asking you to fix anything," Katie said quickly. I'm just saying that if something's happening, if Emma's in trouble somehow, maybe your being here isn't a coincidence. Maybe it's timing. Before Jake could respond, Ashley Morgan burst through the door, her bridesmaid dress slightly askew, and her usually composed demeanor cracked with barely contained panic. Is Emma with you? Ashley's eyes darted between Jake and Katie. Please tell me she's with you. Katie immediately shifted into crisis mode. What do you mean? She's supposed to be getting ready with the other bridesmaids. She never came home last night. Ashley's words came out in a rush. I waited up until 2 a.m., then figured she'd decided to stay at her own house. But when I went to pick her up this morning, Marcus said she'd left early to help with wedding preparations. Only she never showed up here, and no one's seen her since. She left the country club last night. Jake felt ice form in his stomach. What about her car? Still in her driveway. Marcus said she took a cab, that she didn't want to risk driving after having wine at dinner. But, Jake. Ashley's voice dropped to a whisper. I know Emma. She doesn't just disappear. She doesn't miss commitments, especially not Katie's wedding. Something's wrong. Katie sank into a chair, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. Oh God. What if something happened to her? What if... Let's not panic, Jake said, though his own mind was racing through increasingly dark possibilities. Maybe she went for a walk, lost track of time. Maybe her phone died. There could be dozens of explanations. But even as he spoke, the words, Jake remembered the fragility he'd seen in Emma the night before, the desperation beneath her carefully controlled facade. He remembered Marcus's cold fury, the possessive way he'd appeared on the terrace, the veiled threats wrapped in concerned husband rhetoric. Ashley pulled out her phone. I've called her cell a dozen times. It goes straight to voicemail. I even called her father. He hasn't heard from her either, and he's starting to worry. What about Marcus? Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Claims he's worried sick, of course. Says they had a small disagreement after they got home, nothing serious, just wedding stress. Says Emma was upset about something and told him she needed space to think. Ashley's expression grew grim. He's playing the concerned husband perfectly, Jake. To anyone who doesn't know better, he looks like the victim here. Katie stood up abruptly, her expression shifting from worry to determination. We have to find her. Ashley, can you handle the other bridesmaids? Make some excuse about Emma running an errand? Katie, no. Jake caught his sister's arm. This is your wedding day. You can't. The hell I can't. Katie's voice carried the steel that had gotten her through childhood in a working-class family and college on academic scholarships. Emma has been my friend for 13 years. She was there for me when Dad died, when I was scared about college, when I met Dave and needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy for falling in love. If she's missing, if she's in trouble, I'm not walking down that aisle until I know she's safe. Jake looked at his sister. Beautiful, fierce, absolutely immovable when she'd made up her mind, and felt a surge of pride mixed with dread. Okay, but we do this smart. We don't go in blind and make things worse. Ashley nodded grimly. What do you want to know? Everything. Start with last night after Marcus took her home. Ashley took a shaky breath. I followed them out to the parking lot just to make sure Emma was okay. I heard them in their car. Marcus was angry, asking her what she talked to you about, accusing her of embarrassing him. Emma kept apologizing, saying it was nothing, just old friends catching up. Jake felt rage building in his chest. And then? They drove away. But Jake... Emma looked back at me through the car window, and her expression... Ashley shuddered. She looked terrified. The three of them stood in silence for a moment, processing the implications. Outside, Jake could hear the sounds of a wedding beginning. Musicians tuning instruments, guests arriving, the normal happy chaos of a celebration. Inside, they were facing the possibility that something terrible had happened to Emma Sullivan. There's more, Ashley said quietly. Things Emma's told me over the past few months. About Marcus, about their marriage. What kind of things? Katie asked. Ashley glanced at Jake, then seemed to make a decision. He's been escalating. The control, the manipulation, the physical intimidation. Emma's been planning to leave him, but she's been terrified about the consequences. For her father's business, for everyone. Jake felt pieces clicking into place. Emma's confession about Marcus controlling her finances. Her father's dependence on Marcus's legal work. The careful web of isolation and dependence Marcus had constructed. "You think he found out?" Jake said. It wasn't a question. "I think your being here, your success, the way people were talking about you last night, it threatened something fundamental in Marcus's worldview. He spent 6 years convincing Emma she made the right choice, that she needed him, that she couldn't survive without him. And then you show up, proof that she could have had a different life." Katie was pacing now, her wedding dress swishing with each sharp turn. So where would he take her? If he did something? Ashley and Jake exchanged glances. They were moving beyond missing person territory into something much darker. "His family has property," Ashley said slowly. "A cabin up at Lake Morrison, about an hour north. Emma mentioned it once, said it was isolated, that Marcus liked to go there when he needed to think." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. An isolated cabin. A man who'd built his life around control and dominance, facing the possibility of losing everything. A woman who'd finally started to recognize her own strength. "We need to call the police," Katie said. "And tell them what?" Jake asked. "That a woman didn't show up for wedding preparations? That her husband says they had an argument? Ashley, has Emma ever filed a report? Any documented history of abuse?" Ashley shook her head miserably. "He's too smart for that. Everything's psychological, emotional, and when he does get physical, it's always subtle. Bruises that could be accidents, pain that doesn't leave marks." Jake pulled out his phone and started scrolling through contacts. "I'm calling someone, a private investigator I work with in Boston. If Emma's at that cabin, if she's in danger, we need to know fast." "Jake." Katie caught his arm. "What if we're wrong? What if she just needed space, time to think? What if we go charging in and make everything worse?" Jake looked at his sister, seeing the hope in her eyes that this was all a misunderstanding, that Emma would appear any moment with an innocent explanation and a sheepish smile. He wanted to believe it too. But he remembered the fear in Emma's eyes on the terrace, the way she'd flinched when Marcus appeared, the careful way she'd spoken about her marriage like she was defusing a bomb. "Then we'll have made a mistake," Jake said quietly. "But if we're right and we do nothing—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ashley was already moving toward the door. "I'm going to check the cabin. I know where it is, Emma. And I drove up there once when Marcus was out of town, and she wanted to prove to herself she could still make her own decisions." "You're not going alone," Jake said immediately. "Jake, you can't leave," Katie protested. "You're my best man. The ceremony starts in 2 hours." Jake looked at his sister, torn between his duty to her happiness and his growing certainty that Emma was in real danger. "Katie, go." The voice came from the doorway, where Dave Morrison, Katie's fiancé, stood still in his tuxedo, having clearly overheard enough to understand the situation. "Go find Emma. Katie and I can figure out the wedding." Katie turned to her fiancé, her eyes filling with tears. "Dave, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Dave moved to Katie's side, taking her hands in his. "Honey, you've been worried about Emma for months. If she's in trouble, if there's even a chance she needs help, we can't just ignore it because it's inconvenient timing." Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward his future brother-in-law. "Dave, take Ashley, find Emma, make sure she's safe. We'll hold things here as long as we can. If you're not back in time." Dave shrugged. "Then we'll have a wedding story, to tell our grandkids about how love means protecting the people who need protecting, even when it's complicated." Katie stood on her tiptoes and kissed her fiancé, her wedding makeup already starting to smudge with tears. "This is why I'm marrying you." Jake was already moving toward the door, his mind shifting into the focused intensity that had served him well in business crises. But this wasn't about market fluctuations or product launches. This was about Emma Richardson, the girl who'd broken his heart. The woman who'd apologized on a moonlit terrace. The person who might be paying the ultimate price for finally recognizing her own worth. "Ashley," he called as they headed for the parking lot. "How long to the cabin?" 45 minutes if we push it, she replied, already climbing into his Tesla. As Jake started the car, he caught sight of the wedding preparations continuing. In the garden, flowers being arranged, chairs being positioned, a celebration of love and commitment and the promise of a future built on trust and mutual respect. Everything Emma Sullivan had never had. Everything she'd been denied by her own fear and Marcus's calculated manipulation. Jake pulled out of the country club's circular drive with the strange sensation that he was driving toward a confrontation, 9 years in the making. Not just with Marcus Sullivan, but with his own past, his own choices, and the question of whether some people could be saved from the lives they'd built on foundations of fear. Behind them, Katie's wedding waited in suspended animation. Ahead, an isolated cabin by a lake held answers that might change everything. And somewhere between the past and the future, between regret and redemption, Jake Thompson prepared to discover whether the man he'd become was strong enough to save the woman who'd once destroyed him. The cabin at Lake Morrison sat like a dark secret among the pine trees, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness back at Jake and Ashley as they approached through the forest. Jake's Tesla was parked a quarter-mile down the access road, hidden behind a stand of birch trees that provided cover from anyone who might be watching. The silence was wrong. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through branches and the distant lap of water against the shore. Jake felt every nerve-ending fire with warning signals as they crept closer to the structure Marcus Sullivan's family had owned for 3 generations. "There," Ashley breathed, pointing toward the side of the cabin where Marcus's BMW sat partially, concealed under a carport. "He's here." Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his private investigator. "Property records confirm Sullivan family ownership. Local sheriff's department has no recent calls to this location. Proceed with extreme caution." They'd found her. The knowledge sat in Jake's stomach like a stone, because finding Emma didn't guarantee she was alive, didn't guarantee they weren't too late. Ashley was already moving toward the cabin's back entrance, her nurse's training evident in the calm efficiency of her movements. Jake followed, his business shoes silent on the carpet of pine needles that had been accumulating for decades. The back door was unlocked. Jake's hand hesitated on the handle for a moment, understanding that opening it would change everything. For him, for Emma, for the careful fiction Marcus had constructed around his perfect marriage. Then he turned the handle and stepped into a nightmare. The cabin's main room was a testament to old money and masculine dominance. Dark wood paneling, mounted deer heads, leather furniture that spoke of generations of Sullivan men retreating, here to drink whiskey and make decisions about other people's lives. But it was the overturned furniture, the broken lamp, the scattered papers that told the real story. And in the center of it all, Marcus Sullivan sat in a wingback chair, like a king surveying his kingdom, a glass of whiskey in one hand and a pistol resting casually on the arm of his chair. He looked up as Jake and Ashley entered, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been relief. "Well," Marcus said conversationally, as if they'd just arrived for a social visit. "I wondered when someone would come looking for her." Jake's eyes swept the room, cataloging details with the precision that had made him successful in business negotiations. The gun, a .38 revolver, probably Marcus's father's. The whiskey bottle, half empty. The blood on Marcus's knuckles. The absence of Emma. "Where is she?" Jake's voice came out steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Marcus smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Safe, secure. Finally learning the consequences of betrayal and ingratitude." Ashley stepped forward, her medical training overriding her fear. "Marcus, if Emma's hurt, if she needs medical attention." "She needs to understand her place," Marcus interrupted, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to slow children. "She needs to remember who saved her from a life of uncertainty and poverty, who gave her everything she ever claimed to want." Jake felt something cold and precise click into place in his mind, the same clarity that had served him in hostile business negotiations and boardroom confrontations. Marcus was drunk, armed, and clearly past the point of rational decision-making. But he was also talking. which meant Emma was likely still alive. "You're right," Jake said, moving slowly into the room. "You did give her security, stability, everything she thought she wanted when she was young and scared." Marcus's eyes sharpened with interest and suspicion. "Exactly. And then you had to come back, didn't you? Had to remind her of childish dreams and romantic nonsense. Had to make her question the life I built for her." "Is that what this is about?" Jake kept his voice calm, conversational. "My return to Millbrook? This is about ingratitude." Marcus's grip tightened on the pistol. "This is about a woman who forgot how fortunate she was, who started believing she deserved more than what I'd already given her. This is about consequences for betrayal." Ashley had moved to the fireplace, her position giving her a clear view of the hallway that led to the cabin's bedrooms. Jake caught her eye and saw her nod slightly. She'd spotted something, some sign of where Emma might be. "Marcus," Jake said carefully, "Emma told me about her doubts, about feeling trapped, but she also told me about her loyalty to you, to your marriage. She never betrayed you." Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "She betrayed me the moment she started questioning our life together. The moment she started looking at you with regret instead of relief. The moment she made me look like a fool in front of this entire goddamn town." Jake could see the spiral of Marcus's thinking, how Emma's growing independence, her moment of honesty on the terrace, her simple act of speaking to another man, had been interpreted as the ultimate betrayal by someone who saw women as possessions rather than people. "Where is she, Marcus?" Jake asked again, stepping closer. "Learning." Marcus's voice took on an almost dreamy quality. "Learning that choices have consequences. That when you bite the hand that feeds you, sometimes the hand bites back." The implication hit Jake like a physical blow. Emma wasn't just being held, she was being punished. And Marcus, in his alcoholic self-righteousness, clearly believed he was justified in whatever he'd done to her. Ashley was moving again, slipping, toward the hallway, with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent years navigating hospital emergencies. Jake kept talking, keeping Marcus's attention focused on him. "You know what the real tragedy is, Marcus," Jake said, his voice taking on the edge that had intimidated corporate rivals and venture capitalists. "You had everything. Beautiful wife, successful practice, respect in the community, and you threw it all away because you couldn't handle the possibility that she might have choices." Marcus's face darkened. "I didn't throw anything away. She did. The moment she started dreaming about different lives, better lives, lives that didn't include me." "No," Jake said quietly. "You threw it away the moment you decided love meant control instead of trust." The words hit their target. Marcus surged to his feet, the gun coming up with him, his careful composure finally cracking to reveal the rage and insecurity underneath. "Love?" Marcus's voice rose to something approaching a shout. "I loved her enough to save her from poverty. I loved her enough to give her everything she said she wanted. I loved her enough to forgive her for settling for me, instead of waiting for you." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Marcus had always known that Emma had chosen him as a safe second choice, had spent 6 years building a marriage on the foundation of his own inadequacy and her resigned acceptance. "Marcus." Ashley's voice carried from the hallway, tight with controlled panic. "I need you to put the gun down. Emma needs medical attention, now." Marcus spun toward Ashley's voice, the pistol wavering in his grip. "She needs to learn." Jake moved. 9 years of disciplined fitness training, of competitive tennis, and marathon running, condensed into a single moment of explosive action. He covered the distance between himself and Marcus in 3 strides, his hand closing around Marcus's wrist as the gun discharged into the ceiling with a sound like thunder in the enclosed space. They went down hard, Marcus's whiskey-sodden reflexes, no match for Jake's desperation-fueled strength. The gun skittered across the hardwood floor, coming to rest under the fieldstone fireplace as Jake pinned Marcus to the ground. "Ashley!" Jake called, his knee pressed firmly into Marcus's back. "How bad?" Ashley's voice carried from what Jake assumed was a bedroom. "Conscious but hurt. We need an ambulance. Now." Jake pulled out his phone with his free hand, Marcus struggling weakly beneath him like a landed fish. But as he started to dial 911, Marcus began to laugh, a sound so broken and bitter it raised the hair on Jake's arms. "You think you've won something," Marcus gasped between attempts at laughter. "You think you've saved her. But you haven't seen what I've done to her, Jake. You haven't seen what 6 years of loving her has cost both of us." Jake felt ice form in his chest. "What are you talking about?" "Ask her," Marcus whispered, his voice taking on the quality of someone sharing a terrible secret. "Ask her what she's willing to do to keep her father's business from being destroyed. Ask her what she's willing to sacrifice to keep me from ruining everyone she's ever cared about. Ask her how much of herself she's willing to give up to protect other people from the consequences of her choices." The emergency dispatcher answered Jake's call, and he forced himself to focus on providing clear, concise information about their location and the situation. But Marcus's words echoed in his mind like a curse. Because Jake was beginning to understand that saving Emma from Marcus might be only the beginning. That the real battle, the fight for Emma's sense of self-worth, her ability to trust her own judgment, her willingness to believe she deserved better, might be harder to win than a physical confrontation with an abusive husband. In the bedroom, Ashley's voice rose in gentle reassurance, the professional calm of someone who'd spent years helping people through their worst moments. "It's okay, Emma. You're safe now. Jake's here. Help is coming." But Jake remained on the floor, holding down a man who'd systematically destroyed the woman Jake had once loved, and wondered if safety was something Emma would ever truly be able to feel again. If trust was something she'd ever be able to give. If the damage Marcus had done went too deep for healing, even with all the time and patience and love in the world. Marcus had stopped struggling, his body going limp with defeat or exhaustion, or the simple recognition that his carefully constructed world had finally collapsed around him. But his words hung in the air like smoke. "Ask her what she's willing to sacrifice." And Jake realized that rescuing Emma from this cabin might be the easy part. The hard part would be convincing her that she was worth saving. The ambulance arrived 23 minutes after Jake's call, followed closely by the county sheriff and a parade of emergency vehicles that turned the quiet lake road into a corridor of flashing lights and radio chatter. Jake sat on the cabin's front steps, watching paramedics wheel Emma toward the ambulance on a stretcher, her face pale but alert as Ashley walked beside her, maintaining the steady stream of professional reassurance that had probably saved Emma's life as much as their arrival had. Sheriff Coleman was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of calm competence that Jake associated with people who'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. She'd separated Jake and Ashley from Marcus immediately, taking their statements with methodical precision, while her deputies photographed the scene and collected evidence. "Mr. Thompson," Sheriff Coleman said, settling onto the steps beside him with a grunt that spoke of too many years chasing criminals through rough terrain. "Want to walk me through this one more time? Start with why you and Ms. Morgan came looking for Mrs. Sullivan in the first place." Jake had already told the story twice, but he understood the process. In situations like this, consistency mattered. Details mattered. The difference between self-defense and assault often came down to the sequence of events and the credibility of witnesses. "Emma didn't show up for wedding preparations this morning," Jake said. "Ashley was worried because Emma doesn't miss commitments, especially not for close friends. When we couldn't reach her, and her husband claimed they'd had an argument, Ashley remembered this place, and you decided to investigate yourselves instead of calling us because—" Jake met the sheriff's steady gaze. "Because domestic abuse cases are complicated. Because without evidence of immediate danger, there might not have been grounds for a welfare check. Because we were afraid that by the time official channels moved, it might be too late." Sheriff Coleman nodded slowly. "Ms. Morgan mentioned that Mrs. Sullivan had confided in her about marital problems, controlling behavior, emotional abuse, financial manipulation. But no previous reports were filed." "Emma was afraid," Jake said simply. "Marcus Sullivan is a prominent attorney with connections throughout the county. Emma's father's business depends on Marcus's legal work. Emma herself had been isolated from employment, from financial independence, from any support system that wasn't controlled by her husband. And what's your relationship to Mrs. Sullivan? The question Jake had been dreading. The answer that would complicate everything and invite scrutiny of his motives, his presence, his right to be involved in this situation at all. We dated in college, Jake said. It ended badly. I left town 9 years ago and haven't been back until this weekend for my sister's wedding. Sheriff Coleman's expression didn't change, but Jake could see her processing the implications. So this is about old feelings? Unfinished business? This is about a woman being hurt by someone who was supposed to protect her, Jake replied, his voice gaining edge. This is about recognizing abuse and acting to stop it. Whatever happened between Emma and me 9 years ago doesn't change the fact that she was in danger. No, Sheriff Coleman agreed. It doesn't. Though it does raise questions about your judgment, your objectivity, your ability to assess the situation clearly. Jake felt anger rise in his chest, then forced it down. The sheriff was doing her job, asking the questions that any competent investigator would ask. The fact that she was probably right, that his history with Emma had clouded his judgment, made him more likely to assume the worst about Marcus, more willing to take risks to play hero, didn't make the questions less irritating. Sheriff, Ashley's voice carried across the clearing as she approached from the ambulance. Emma's stable. Concussion, bruised ribs, various contusions consistent with being knocked around, but she's conscious and coherent. She wants to talk. Sheriff Coleman stood, brushing pine needles from her uniform. Good. Mr. Thompson, you'll need to come to the station later to finish your statement. Ms. Morgan, I'll need the same from you, and I'll want a full medical report on Mrs. Sullivan's injuries. Jake watched the ambulance pull away, Emma's pale face visible through the rear window. She'd looked at him as they loaded her into the vehicle, a long, complicated look that held gratitude and regret and something that might have been apology. Jake. Ashley appeared at his elbow, her scrubs stained with blood and her usual composure showing cracks. I'm riding with her to the hospital. Are you? I'll follow, Jake said. Need to check in with Katie first, let her know Emma's safe. Ashley nodded, then paused. Jake? What Marcus said about Emma being willing to sacrifice herself, to protect other people? He wasn't lying. She's going to try to downplay what happened here, try to take responsibility for his actions. She's going to worry more about the consequences for everyone else than about getting justice for herself. Jake felt the truth of Ashley's words settle in his stomach like lead. What do you want me to do about it? I don't know. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But don't let her disappear into herself. Don't let her convince herself that this was somehow her fault. Ashley jogged toward her car, leaving Jake alone with the sheriff and the crime scene, and the weight of decisions he wasn't qualified to make. His phone buzzed with a text from Katie. Is she okay? Dave and I are holding the wedding until you get back. Everyone's worried. Jake stared at the message, trying to process the fact that his sister's wedding was still waiting, still suspended in time while he dealt with the wreckage of Emma's marriage. The normal world, celebrations and happiness and futures built on love and trust, felt impossibly distant from this clearing where violence and control had played out their inevitable conclusion. He called Katie, choosing words carefully as he explained that Emma was hurt but safe, that Marcus was in custody, that the immediate crisis was over. But even as he spoke, Jake could feel the larger implications settling around him like a fog. Marcus would be charged with assault, domestic abuse, probably unlawful imprisonment, but he was a lawyer with connections and resources, and domestic violence cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute successfully. Emma would have to testify, would have to relive the worst moments of her marriage in front of a jury, would have to defend her own actions and choices while her abuser's attorney tried to paint her as an unfaithful wife who'd provoked her husband's anger. And through it all, Marcus's threats would hang over her head like a sword. His ability to destroy her father's business, to ruin the financial security of everyone she cared about, to make her pay for leaving him in ways that extended far beyond physical violence. Jake ended the call with Katie and stood in the clearing, listening to the sounds of law enforcement processing a crime scene. Sheriff Coleman was interviewing one of her deputies, their voices carrying across the pine-scented air with professional efficiency. Marcus had been loaded into a police cruiser 20 minutes ago, still drunk and belligerent, shouting about ungrateful wives and men who didn't understand their place. But Marcus's words from the cabin echoed in Jake's mind. Ask her what she's willing to sacrifice. Because Jake was beginning to understand that Emma's ordeal was far from over. That the choice between safety and security, between freedom and the protection of everyone she loved, was about to become more complicated than ever. His phone rang. An unknown number with a local area code. Jake Thompson. Mr. Thompson, this is Robert Richardson, Emma's father. The voice was strained, older than Jake remembered, weighted with worry and confusion. I'm at the hospital. Ashley Morgan called me, told me what happened. I need to understand what's been going on with my daughter. Jake felt his chest tighten. Robert Richardson, the man whose approval Emma had spent her life seeking, whose financial security had been used as leverage to keep her trapped in an abusive marriage. Mr. Richardson, I think that's a conversation you need to have with Emma. I'm having it with you first. Robert's voice carried the authority of someone used to getting answers. Because according to the sheriff's department, you were involved in whatever happened at that cabin. And according to my daughter, you've been back in town for less than 48 hours, but somehow knew enough about her marriage to mount a rescue mission. Jake closed his eyes, understanding that this conversation would determine not just his own future, but Emma's as well. Robert Richardson held keys that Marcus had used to lock Emma in her marriage. Financial dependence, family loyalty, the fear of disappointing the people she loved most. Your daughter's been in an abusive marriage for years, Jake said quietly. Marcus has been controlling her, isolating her, using your business relationship as leverage to keep her from leaving. Today, that escalated to physical violence. Silence on the other end of the line. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was smaller, older. How long have you known? I suspected something was wrong yesterday at the rehearsal dinner. Emma confirmed it last night when we talked privately. But Mr. Richardson, this isn't about what I knew or when I knew it. This is about your daughter finally having the chance to build a life based on her own choices instead of other people's expectations. Another long pause. Jake, I need you to understand something. My business, my employees, my ability to support my wife's medical care, all of that depends on relationships Marcus helped me build. If this becomes a public scandal, if Marcus goes to prison, the consequences won't just affect Emma. And there it was. The trap Marcus had built so carefully, using Robert Richardson's own love for his family as the bars of his daughter's cage. Mr. Richardson, Jake said carefully, what's more important to you? Your business relationships or your daughter's safety? That's not fair. No, Jake agreed. It's not. None of this is fair. But Marcus made sure it wouldn't be fair when he systematically destroyed Emma's independence and used your love for her as a weapon against her. Jake could hear the older man breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel him wrestling with the impossible choice Marcus had created. What do you want from me? Robert asked finally. I want you to tell your daughter that she's worth more than your business. I want you to tell her that her happiness matters more than your financial security. I want you to give her permission to choose herself over everyone else's expectations. And if I can't do that? Jake felt something cold and final settle in his chest. Then Marcus wins. Even from a jail cell, even after what he did to her today, he wins. Because Emma will sacrifice herself to protect you, just like she's been doing for 6 years. The line went quiet except for the sound of Robert Richardson's breathing and the distant hum of hospital machinery. In that silence, Jake could feel the weight of Emma's future hanging in the balance. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I never wanted her to be unhappy. I just wanted her to be safe. Then let her choose safety on her own terms, Jake said. Let her decide what kind of life is worth living. After he ended the call, Jake stood in the clearing for another few minutes, watching the crime scene team finish their work. The cabin looked peaceful now, innocent in the afternoon sunlight. No sign of the violence that had occurred here. No indication that a woman's life had nearly been destroyed in service of one man's need for control. But Marcus's influence would outlive his physical presence. His threats would echo in every decision Emma made about her future. His systematic destruction of her confidence would take years to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. Jake climbed into his Tesla and pointed it toward the hospital, knowing that the hardest conversations were still ahead. With Emma, about what came next. With Katie, about postponing her wedding while they dealt with the aftermath. with himself, about whether he had any right to be involved in Emma's healing process, or whether his presence would only complicate her recovery. But as he drove through the pine forests toward Millbrook General Hospital, Jake found himself thinking about the woman who'd broken his heart 9 years ago, and the woman who'd apologized on a moonlit terrace 2 nights past. They were the same person, but they were also completely different. One had been driven by fear to make choices that protected everyone except herself. The other was fighting to find the courage to make choices that honored her own worth. And somewhere between those two women, Emma Sullivan was discovering what it meant to be free. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear, 2 scents that Jake had hoped never to encounter together again. Emma lay propped against white pillows, her dark hair stark against the sterile bedding, purple bruises blooming across her collarbone, like some terrible flower. But her eyes were alert, focused, and when she saw Jake in the doorway, something that might have been relief flickered across her features. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Jake moved into the room, noting how she flinched slightly when he approached the bed. The gesture was so small, so automatic, that he wondered if she even realized she'd done it. "I wasn't sure. After everything that's happened, everything I've put you through." Emma's hand moved to her throat, where finger-shaped bruises were visible above the hospital gown's neckline. "I keep thinking this is all some terrible dream, and I'm going to wake up back in that house, pretending everything is normal." Jake pulled up the visitor's chair, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. Ashley had briefed him on the drive over. Trauma victims often struggled with sudden movements, unexpected touches, anything that might trigger the fight-or-flight response that was still running high in their systems. "It's not a dream," Jake said quietly. "Marcus is in custody. You're safe, and whatever happens next is entirely up to you." Emma's laugh was bitter, broken. "Is it? Because I've been lying here for the past 2 hours thinking about all the ways this could destroy everyone I care about. My father's business, Ashley's nursing license if they find out she helped you break into private property. Your sister's wedding that got postponed because of my drama. Katie's been planning that day for 2 years, Jake, and now—" "Katie postponed her own wedding," Jake interrupted. "Her choice. Dave's choice. Because they care about you more than they care about perfect timing. They shouldn't have to make that choice. No one should have to make choices because of my mistakes." Jake felt a familiar frustration rise in his chest, the same feeling he'd had watching Emma make decisions based on everyone else's needs except her own. "Emma, you didn't make Marcus violent. You didn't make him controlling. You didn't create this situation. Didn't I?" Emma's voice grew stronger, edged with the kind of self-recrimination that Jake recognized from his own darkest moments. "I chose him, Jake. I chose security over love, status over authenticity. I chose a man I didn't really know because he represented everything I thought I needed. And then I spent 6 years enabling his behavior, making excuses, covering for him, telling myself it was normal. It was what marriage looked like. It was what I deserved for making such a calculated choice in the first place." Jake watched her spiral into the familiar pattern of self-blame, understanding now why Marcus had been so successful in controlling her. Emma's natural tendency toward responsibility, toward protecting others, had been weaponized against her, until she'd learned to see every problem as somehow her fault. "Emma." Jake kept his voice gentle but firm. "Look at me." She did, reluctantly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You were 22 years old when you made that choice. You were afraid, inexperienced, trying to build a life based on what you thought adulthood looked like. That doesn't make you responsible for Marcus's decision to abuse you. But if you'd chosen differently, you might have been happy. Or you might have faced different challenges, different mistakes, different lessons, to learn. But Marcus's choice to hurt you, to control you, to systematically destroy your confidence and independence, those were his choices, Emma, not yours." Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands where they lay folded on the white hospital blanket. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I keep thinking about the woman I used to be. Before Marcus. Before the marriage, even before college. I used to paint, did you know that? I was good at it. I had plans to apply to graduate programs, maybe teach art, maybe open a gallery someday. I had opinions about politics, about books, about movies. I had friends who challenged me, who made me laugh, who saw me as more than just someone's girlfriend or wife or daughter. Jake felt his chest tighten. What happened to her? Marcus happened. Little by little, year by year. First it was suggestions that my art was a nice hobby but not practical, that my friends were too liberal, too frivolous, that my opinions needed to be more considered, more appropriate for someone in his social circle. Emma's hand moved unconsciously to her ribs, where Jake could see the edge of bandages beneath her hospital gown. Then it became expectations, then requirements, then threats wrapped up as concerns for my well-being. And now? Emma looked at him with something that might have been hope struggling against despair. Now I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what I actually believe, what I actually want, what I'm actually capable of. I've been performing the role of Marcus's wife for so long that I'm not sure there's anything authentic left underneath. The honesty of her admission hit Jake like a physical blow. He thought about the confident, decisive woman he'd fallen in love with in college. The Emma who'd argued passionately about social justice, who'd spent weekends volunteering at women's shelters, who'd painted watercolors that captured light and shadow with startling emotional precision. Marcus hadn't just isolated her physically and financially. He'd systematically erased the person she'd been until only the shell remained. She's still there, Jake said quietly. The woman you were becoming. She's still there, Emma. It's just going to take time to find her again. What if I can't? What if 6 years of being Marcus's wife has damaged something essential in me? What if I'm too broken to rebuild? Before Jake could answer, the door opened, and Robert Richardson entered, his face gray with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. He stopped short when he saw Jake, his expression cycling through surprise, suspicion, and resignation. Dad. Emma's voice was small, uncertain. I wasn't sure you'd come. Robert moved to the bed, his movements careful and deliberate. Of course I came. You're my daughter. I should have come years ago. Should have seen what was happening. Should have... His voice broke, and Jake saw the moment when Robert Richardson finally understood the true cost of the choices he'd encouraged his daughter to make. Mr. Richardson, Jake said, standing to offer the older man his chair. No. Robert's voice was firm. Stay, please. I think this conversation needs to include you. Jake remained standing as Robert settled into the chair, watching the careful dynamics between father and daughter play out in glances and gestures. Emma, Robert said quietly, I talked to the sheriff. I know what Marcus did to you today. I know what he's been doing to you for years, and I know that my business relationship with him, my dependence on his connections, has been used as leverage to keep you trapped. Emma's face went very still. Dad, let me finish. Robert's voice gained strength. I built my business to provide security for this family, to make sure you and your mother never had to worry about money the way I worried growing up. But somewhere along the way, I started valuing that security more than your happiness. I started seeing Marcus's financial contributions as more important than your emotional well-being. Jake watched Emma's expressions cycle through hope and fear, understanding that this conversation would determine not just her immediate future, but her ability to see herself as worthy of protection and love. I'm dissolving my business relationship with Marcus, Robert continued. Effective immediately. I'll find other attorneys, rebuild the connections, start over if I have to. Your mother and I will figure out how to manage her medical expenses without his help, because no amount of financial security is worth watching my daughter disappear into someone else's idea of who she should be. Emma's composure finally cracked, tears streaming down her face as she reached for her father's hand. But Dad, the practice, Mom's treatments, everything you've worked for, will be rebuilt by someone who didn't fail to protect his daughter when she needed him most. Robert's voice was fierce with determination and regret. Emma, I won't pretend this won't be difficult. Starting over at 62, with your mother's medical bills and the reputation damage from cutting ties with Marcus publicly. It's going to be a challenge. Then don't do it, Emma said quickly. Dad, I can handle this. I can figure out how to make the marriage work, how to manage Marcus's moods, how to— No. Robert's voice cut through her automatic self-sacrifice with surprising firmness. No more managing, no more accommodating, no more sacrificing yourself for other people's comfort, including mine. Jake felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. A recognition that this moment was a turning point not just for Emma, but for the entire family dynamic that had shaped her choices. But what about— Emma began. What about you? Robert interrupted. What about your happiness, your safety, your right to build a life based on your own values instead of other people's expectations? Emma, I spent so many years trying to give you security that I forgot to give you permission to choose your own version of happiness. Emma was crying openly now, the kind of tears that came from releasing pressure that had been building for years. Jake found himself thinking about chains, how they could be made of gold and good intentions, how they could be forged by people who genuinely believed they were offering protection rather than creating prisons. Jake. Robert's voice drew him back to the present. I owe you an apology and an explanation. Jake waited, understanding that whatever came next would shape not just his relationship with Emma, but his understanding of the forces that had driven her choices 9 years ago. When Emma started dating you in college, I was terrified, Robert admitted. Not of you personally, but of what you represented. Uncertainty, risk, the possibility that my daughter might choose love over security, passion over stability. I'd grown up poor, Jake. I'd watched my own father struggle to support his family, watched my mother go without basic necessities so we kids could have what we needed. When Marcus came along with his family connections and guaranteed future, it felt like a gift from God. Jake felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Robert's influence on Emma's decision, the pressure she'd felt to choose the safe path, the way her rejection of him had been as much about family expectations as personal choice. I encouraged her to choose Marcus, Robert continued. I told her that love was a luxury young people couldn't afford, that building a life required practical decisions rather than romantic dreams. I convinced her that choosing you would be selfish, impractical, potentially devastating for her future security. Dad, Emma whispered. I was wrong. Robert's voice was heavy with regret. I was so afraid of her facing the struggles I'd faced that I pushed her toward a different kind of prison. I prioritized my own peace of mind over her happiness, and I've spent 6 years watching my vibrant, passionate daughter disappear into someone else's shadow. The room fell silent, except for the soft sounds of medical equipment and Emma's quiet crying. Jake felt the weight of understanding settling over him, not just about Emma's choices, but about the complex web of family dynamics, economic fears, and generational trauma that had shaped them. So what happens now? Emma asked finally, her voice small but stronger than it had been. Robert stood up, his movements careful but determined. Now you get to decide. Not me, not Marcus, not anyone else's expectations or fears. You get to choose what kind of life you want to build, what kind of person you want to become, what kind of future feels worth pursuing. Jake watched Emma process her father's words, seeing the moment when possibility began to compete with fear in her expression. And if I make mistakes, she asked, if I choose wrong again? Then you'll learn from them, Robert said simply. Like every other adult gets to do. But they'll be your mistakes to make, your lessons to learn, your life to build. Emma looked between her father and Jake, her expression cycling through amazement, terror, and something that might have been the beginning of hope. For the first time in 6 years, Emma Richardson Sullivan was free to choose. The question now was whether she'd remember how. 3 days after the cabin incident, Emma sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes of belongings retrieved from the house she'd shared with Marcus. The room hadn't changed much since high school. Same pale yellow walls, same white furniture, same view of the maple tree she'd climbed as a child when the world felt too complicated for a 12-year-old to navigate. Now, at 31, she was learning that some complications only grew more tangled with age. Jake knocked on the doorframe, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the careful expression of someone navigating emotional landmines. "Your dad said you might want some company." Emma gestured to the floor beside her bed, where she'd been sorting through 6 years of accumulated possessions. Wedding gifts she'd never loved. Books Marcus had chosen for their library. Clothes that had been selected to project an image, rather than express personality. "I'm trying to figure out what's actually mine," Emma said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "It's harder than it sounds. I can't tell the difference between things I chose and things I was told to choose anymore." Jake settled onto the floor, noting the careful distance Emma maintained between them. 3 days of medical attention had faded the worst of her bruises, but the emotional wounds were still raw, still requiring delicate handling. "What about this?" Jake picked up a watercolor painting from one of the boxes, a landscape that captured the golden light of late afternoon with the kind of emotional precision that spoke of genuine artistic talent. Emma's face softened. "I painted that the summer before my senior year of college. It's the view from the back porch of my grandmother's house in Vermont. I went there to think, to try to figure out what I wanted to do after graduation. It's beautiful. You should have kept painting." Marcus said it was self-indulgent, that as his wife, I should focus my creative energy on things that supported our social goals. Charity galas, dinner parties, making our home into a showcase. Emma's voice was flat, reporting facts without emotion. He wasn't cruel about it exactly. He just made it clear that my art was frivolous. Jake studied the painting, seeing not frivolity, but passion, talent, a way of seeing the world that was uniquely Emma's. "What do you think now?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of another canvas. "I think I spent so many years asking what other people wanted from me that I forgot how to ask what I wanted for myself." It was progress, Jake thought. Small, careful progress toward reclaiming her own voice, her own preferences, her own sense of what mattered. "Emma." Jake set down his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "I need to tell you something about the night of the rehearsal dinner. About our conversation on the terrace." Emma looked up from the box she'd been sorting, her expression immediately guarded. "Jake, if this is about what I said about regretting my choices, it's not about that. It's about something I've been carrying for 9 years, something I should have told you before now." Jake felt his chest tighten with the weight of his own confession. "When you rejected me in college, when you said I wasn't someone you could build a future with, it destroyed something fundamental in my understanding of myself." Emma's face went very still. "Jake, let me finish. For 9 years, I built my entire life around proving you wrong. Every business decision, every success, every dollar earned, it was all motivated by the need to demonstrate that I was worthy of love, worthy of consideration, worthy of someone's faith in my potential." Jake's voice grew stronger as he spoke, the words he'd rehearsed but never expected to say finally finding their voice. "I turned your rejection into the foundation of my identity, as someone who had to earn worthiness through achievement." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I never wanted that. I never wanted you to feel, I know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The damage wasn't intentional, but it was real. And I need you to understand something. I can't be your path to redemption. The way you were my motivation for success." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with 9 years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. "What do you mean?" Emma asked quietly. Jake chose his words carefully, understanding that this conversation would determine not just their future, but Emma's ability to build a life based on her own worth, rather than her relationships with other people. "I mean that I can see you looking at me like I might be the answer to fixing what Marcus broke. Like maybe, if we could recapture what we had in college, it would prove that you made the right choice in leaving him. That you're capable of choosing love over security. That you're not too damaged to build something real." Emma's face flushed, but she didn't deny it. "But Emma, healing from what Marcus did to you isn't about finding the right man to replace him. It's about learning to trust your own judgment, to value your own opinions, to build a life that feels authentic to who you are, rather than who someone else wants you to be. So what are you saying? Emma's voice was small, vulnerable. That there's no possibility of us? Jake felt his heart crack at the hope and fear warring in her expression. I'm saying that right now. You need to focus on rediscovering who Emma Richardson is when she's not defined by her relationship to a man. Any man. Including me. Emma was quiet for a long time, her hands moving restlessly through the items in the box. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with tears. You're right. I can feel myself doing it. Looking to you for validation, for proof that I'm capable of making better choices. Looking for you to save me from the mess I made of my life. You saved yourself, Jake said firmly. You found the courage to tell me the truth about your marriage. You survived 6 years of systematic emotional abuse. You're sitting here right now, making your own decisions about what to keep and what to discard from a life that nearly destroyed you. That's not saving, Emma. That's strength. Emma wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. It doesn't feel like strength. It feels like I'm stumbling around in the dark, trying to remember who I used to be. Maybe that's exactly what strength looks like sometimes. Maybe healing isn't about going back to who you were, but about having the courage to discover who you're becoming. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sorting through boxes while September afternoon light streamed through the bedroom. Windows. Jake found himself thinking about the strange circularity of their relationship, how they'd both been shaped by their shared past, how their individual healing journeys had somehow led them back to each other. Not as romantic partners, but as witnesses to each other's growth. Jake, Emma's voice was tentative. What you said about not being able to be my path to redemption. Does that mean you don't want to be part of my life at all? Jake looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not the confident woman who'd rejected him 9 years ago or the broken woman he'd rescued 3 days ago, but someone in between, someone figuring out how to exist in the space between who she'd been and who she might become. I want to be your friend, Jake said honestly. I want to watch you rediscover your love of painting. I want to see you build a career that excites you, develop opinions that are entirely your own, create relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependency or control. And after that? After I've figured out who I am when I'm not defined by someone else? Jake smiled, feeling something settle in his chest that might have been peace. After that, we'll see. Maybe we'll discover that the people we've become are compatible in new ways. Maybe we'll realize that our history is too complicated to build something healthy on. But whatever happens, it will be 2 whole people making a conscious choice rather than 2 wounded people trying to heal each other. Emma nodded slowly, her expression cycling through disappointment, relief, and something that might have been the beginning of excitement about the possibilities ahead. Will you help me? She asked. Not with the healing. I understand that's something I need to do myself. But with the practical stuff? Finding a therapist, maybe looking into going back to school, figuring out how to build a life that's actually mine? Of course, Jake said. That's what friends do. Emma smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Jake had seen from her since his return to Millbrook. Friends. I'd forgotten what that felt like, having friends who wanted to help me succeed, rather than reshape me into someone more convenient. Jake stood up, understanding that this conversation had reached its natural conclusion and that Emma needed space to process what they'd discussed. I should go. Katie wants to have dinner tonight to talk about rescheduling the wedding. Jake? Emma called as he reached the doorway. Thank you. For saving me, yes, but more than that. For seeing me clearly enough to know what I actually need rather than what I think I want. Jake paused in the doorway, looking back at Emma, surrounded by the artifacts of a life she was learning to dismantle and rebuild. That's what love looks like sometimes, Emma. Not rescuing someone, but trusting them to save themselves. As he walked down the stairs of the Richardson house, Jake felt the weight of 9 years of resentment and hurt lifting from his shoulders. Emma was free to discover who she was without Marcus's control, or her father's expectations, or Jake's own complicated history. And Jake was free to build a life based on his own worth, rather than the need to prove himself worthy of someone else's love. Outside, the September air carried the promise of autumn, of change, of seasons turning toward Something new. Jake climbed into his Tesla and pointed it toward town, thinking about Katie's wedding and the future he was finally ready to build. Not as someone running from the past or trying to rewrite it, but as someone who'd learned that some stories didn't need dramatic endings to be complete. They just needed honest ones. 6 months later, the art studio occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Millbrook, with tall windows that caught the morning light and hardwood, floors that bore the scars of decades of creative endeavors. Emma stood before an easel, her hands stained with paint, and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that would have horrified Marcus, but felt perfectly right to her. The painting before her was ambitious, a large canvas that captured the complexity of morning light through autumn trees, but with an emotional depth that spoke of hard-won wisdom rather than youthful enthusiasm. It was the 15th piece she'd completed since enrolling in the graduate art program at the State University, and the first one that felt entirely, authentically hers. It's beautiful. Emma turned to find Jake in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the easy smile that had become familiar over the past 6 months of carefully reconstructed friendship. He visited the studio twice a week, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit quietly while she painted, always respectful of the space she'd created for herself. "Thank you." Emma accepted the coffee, noting how natural it felt now to have him in her space without the complicated weight of unresolved romantic tension. "I'm thinking of submitting it to the regional exhibition in Albany." "You should. It's some of your best work." Jake settled into the worn leather chair she'd placed by the windows, the one piece of furniture she'd bought specifically because it felt like hers, rather than something chosen to impress other people. Emma studied the painting critically, seeing both its strengths and the areas where she could push further. 6 months of intensive therapy with Dr. Sarah Martinez had taught her to trust her own judgment again, to separate Marcus's voice in her head from her own authentic responses to the world around her. "How are the wedding plans coming?" Emma asked, settling onto her paint-splattered stool. Jake's expression brightened. "Katie's finally decided on the flowers. Again. For the 4th time. Dave's threatening to elope to Vegas if she changes. Her mind one more time." Emma laughed, the sound coming easily now in a way it hadn't for years. Katie's wedding had been rescheduled for late spring, giving everyone time to heal from the events of September while maintaining the celebration's essential meaning. Emma would serve as maid of honor, a role she'd initially questioned, but that Katie had insisted on with characteristic stubbornness. "And your business expansion?" "Going well. The Millbrook office opens next month. I'll be splitting time between here and Boston for the first year, but—" Jake paused, his expression growing thoughtful. "It feels good to be investing in this community again, to be building something here rather than just running away from what hurt me." Emma nodded, understanding the sentiment. She'd spent the past 6 months not just healing from Marcus's abuse, but reconciling with the choices that had led her into that relationship. Her weekly therapy sessions had revealed layers of family dynamics, societal pressures, and personal fears that had shaped her decision-making since childhood. "Speaking of building something," Jake said carefully, "there's something I wanted to talk to you about." Emma felt her chest tighten reflexively, then consciously relaxed. 6 months of friendship had taught her that Jake's serious conversations were usually about practical matters, helping her father restructure his business, connecting her with career opportunities, offering support without trying to control or fix her. "What's on your mind?" Jake was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against his coffee cup in the nervous gesture Emma remembered from college. "I've been thinking about us. About where we are now, who we've become, what we've learned." Emma set down her paintbrush, giving him her full attention. They'd had versions of this conversation before, careful check-ins about boundaries, about healing, about the possibility of something more than friendship. But something in Jake's tone suggested this time was different. "I know we agreed to focus on individual growth," Jake continued, "and I think we've both done that work. You've rebuilt your sense of self, discovered what you value when no one else is telling you what to think. I've learned to find worth in who I am, rather than what I can prove to other people." "Jake, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking for promises or commitments or a return to something we were 22. But Emma, I'd like to explore the possibility of dating. Real dating, between two whole people who know themselves and choose each other consciously. Emma felt her heart rate accelerate, but not with the panic she might have expected 6 months ago. Instead, she felt curiosity, excitement, the flutter of genuine anticipation rather than desperate need. "What would that look like?" she asked. Jake smiled. "Honestly, I have no idea. We'd have to figure it out as we go. But I'd like to take you to dinner sometime and have it be a date instead of two friends catching up. I'd like to see if the connection we've built as adults could become something romantic without losing the respect and genuine caring we've developed." Emma studied his face, seeing not the desperate young man who'd tried to propose 9 years ago or the successful but wounded entrepreneur who'd returned to Millbrook seeking vindication. This was Jake as she'd come to know him over the past 6 months. Thoughtful, patient, secure enough in himself to want partnership rather than possession. "I'd like that," Emma said quietly. "But I want to be honest about something. I'm still figuring out who I am in relationships. Still learning to trust my own judgment about romantic feelings versus gratitude or familiarity, or the comfort of having someone who understands my history." "That's exactly why I think we should try," Jake replied. "Because we both know the difference now between healthy love and the desperate kind that tries to fill holes in ourselves. Because we've done the work to become people who can choose each other freely, rather than out of need or fear or unfinished business." Emma stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the town that had shaped both their histories. Millbrook spread below them in its familiar grid of tree-lined streets and modest houses. But it looked different now, not like a trap or a limitation, but like a community where two people could build something real and lasting. "There's something else," Emma said, turning back to Jake. "Marcus's trial starts next month. I'll be testifying, reliving everything that happened, having our private pain dissected in public. It's going to be difficult, probably triggering. Are you prepared for that reality?" Jake's expression grew serious. "Are you asking if I'm committed enough to stick around when things get complicated?" "I'm asking if you understand that healing isn't linear, that I might have bad days, trust issues that resurface, moments when I question my own judgment about everything, including us." Jake stood up and moved toward her, stopping just close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Emma, I spent 9 years building a life around proving I was worthy of love. I'm not going to run away from the real thing because it comes with complications." Emma felt something settle in her chest, not the desperate relief of being rescued, but the quiet satisfaction of being truly seen and accepted. "Okay," she said simply. "Let's try." Jake's smile was radiant. "Yeah? Yeah. But we go slow. We communicate honestly. And we remember that we're choosing this, not falling into it out of habit or history or the assumption that we owe each other something because of the past." "Deal," Jake said, extending his hand with mock formality. Emma shook it, laughing at the gesture. "Should we seal this agreement with a handshake or a kiss?" "Let's start with the handshake," Jake said, though his eyes were warm with possibility. "We've got plenty of time for everything else." Outside the studio windows, Millbrook continued its quiet afternoon rhythms. People going about their lives, building their own versions of happiness and meaning and connection. Inside, two people who'd been shaped by pain and separation were choosing to risk vulnerability again. Not because they needed each other, but because they wanted to see what they could build together. Emma turned back to her painting, seeing it with new eyes. The light streaming through the painted trees wasn't just beautiful, it was hopeful, suggesting possibilities beyond what was immediately visible. Like the future she and Jake were carefully, consciously choosing to explore. For the first time in her adult life, Emma Richardson was making a choice about love based on strength rather than fear, on genuine compatibility rather than security, on the promise of partnership rather than the guarantee of protection. It felt like the beginning of everything she'd never known she wanted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.